Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm Professor Carolyn Guile of the Department of Art and Art History and the new co-director of the Center for Freedom and Western Civilization. I'm often asked, how did I come to join the center? The answer for me is that I study nations and cultures whose civic and personal freedoms have been under assault throughout history. My special interest in Poland, where millions died in World War II, not only in battles, but for their very identities as Poles, Jews, Christians, and Slavs. The freedoms that we have on our campus are blessings we should not take for granted. The freedoms to study and to teach, to spend time with one another, in and outside of the classroom, to discuss, debate, and yes, sometimes argue about the things that matter most to us and to be at liberty to do so. The Center for Freedom and Western Civilization has been established at Colgate University as a forum for civic debate and scholarly research. We believe in the ideals of free speech, free enterprise, and constitutional democracy, especially as they have been understood and established by the American founders. The serious study of these ideals and institutions, from the time of the early American Republic to the contemporary world, is critical in educating citizens and leaders for today. The great debates surrounding the ideals of freedom and democracy need to be presented with respectful appreciation as well as with critical detachment. It is in this spirit that the Center for Freedom hosts conferences and invites lecturers to campus. Tonight's event is one in a year-long series of events that is designed to inspire critical reflection and rigorous discussion at Colgate. Tonight's lecture will address the topic of civil liberties in the age of Trump. We recognize that differing perspectives are the foundation for rigorous engagement, and we anticipate a robust discussion of this topic following the lecture during the Q&A. And now I would like to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Robert Cranack, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Carolyn. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our event tonight. My name is Robert Cranack, and I'm a professor of political science here at Colgate University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Freedom and Western Civilization. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Alan Dershowitz, and to moderate the discussion. We're all aware that tonight is election eve for the 2018 midterm elections. And I'm sure that we have all come here tonight as citizens who love our country and who are concerned about its future. We are keenly aware that our beloved country is divided along party lines and along social issues, and these divisions are disturbing to all of us. How do we talk to people who differ from our own point of view? How do we live together, work together, and move forward as a nation? The good news is that we Americans have faced these kinds of challenges before, and we've managed to deal with them and to overcome them. In my own lifetime, we faced divisions over the Vietnam War, the battle for civil rights, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. Today, there's a feeling that the era of Trump is worse than before, and that the situation is hopeless. But I do not believe that is true. We can rise to the occasion as citizens, committed to civil discourse, and as members of the Colgate University community to solve our problems. One helpful way to proceed, I'd like to suggest, is to recognize that there are no simple answers. There's no simple divisions in our society between red and blue, black and white, friend and foe. Everything is complicated. It is in this spirit that we at the Center for Freedom thought about inviting Alan Dershowitz to Colgate. Alan Dershowitz has been a distinguished professor at Harvard Law School for over 50 years before retiring 4 years ago. He has published 40 books, many scholarly articles, and he has developed a reputation as a defender of civil liberties that has placed him on both sides of the political divide. As he will tell us, he is a lifelong member of the Democratic Party who voted for Obama and Hillary Clinton. And he has found himself at odds today with his fellow liberals by writing a book entitled The Case Against Impeaching Trump. And he wrote another book called The Case Against Boycotting, Divesting, and Sanctioning Israel. And he has criticized the Mueller investigation. As a defense lawyer, he has worked on teams defending highly controversial clients, such as O.J. Simpson, Klaus von Bülow, Michael Milken, and Julian Assange, serving as a lawyer of last resort for vilified clients that has earned him both praise and blame. Perhaps Mr. Dershowitz's approach is summed up in the title of another one of his books, Chutzpah, a Yiddish word that's actually difficult to translate because one is never sure if it is a compliment or a criticism, rather like the British word cheeky, or rather like they say in Brooklyn, which is Mr. Dershowitz's hometown, you got a lot of nerve, buddy. Tonight, we have asked Professor Dershowitz to use some of that cheeky, nervy chutzpah to address the challenging topic of civil liberties in the age of Trump, and to explain why this is a complex problem that defies simple partisanship between left and right. Our format tonight is simple and straightforward. Mr. Dershowitz, Professor Dershowitz, will present an address of about 40 minutes, followed by question and answers for about 30 minutes at the floor microphones, moderated by myself and my colleague, Professor Guile, in which we hope to give as many people as possible a chance to respond, including asking the hardest questions and to argue. Mr. Dershowitz loves to argue. So please, at this time, join me in welcoming Professor Alan Dershowitz to the Colgate community.
Thank you so much.
I hear they're staging their walkout.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Thank Colgate University for inviting me. I invite the students who are protesting to listen to what I have to say and ask me the hardest questions. I promise that I will not refrain from answering any of your questions. You don't even have to ask me questions. You can make comments, critical comments, but I think in an educational institution, it's probably a good idea to listen. You can listen with your back to me. That's a legitimate form of protest. In fact, it's a very good form of protest. So I admire your protests, and I accept your back as a show of a disagreement, even though you haven't yet heard what I have to say. Maybe after you hear what I have to say, your protests will grow or perhaps diminish. I want to start tonight with the poster that was circulated about me. I always like to use the posters that are circulated as an educational moment in which to help teach. And as many of you know, the poster that was circulated accused me of being a child rapist, and accused me of that based exclusively on the fact that, according to the poster, 2.1% of all people who are accused of rape or guilty of rape, and therefore it must follow that I too am guilty of rape, along with every other person who has ever been accused. In other words, there are no distinctions between people based on the evidence. Everybody who's been accused fits into the 2.1% or 97.9%, and so you make generalizations based on that. So let's begin with the 2.1 statistic. According to the FBI, the figure is not 2.1%, it's 8%. None of these figures can be completely accurate because it's impossible to determine which accusations of rape are true and which are false, except for extreme cases on both sides where a man admits it, or there's a videotape, or a woman acknowledges that she made up a false charge, as apparently one of Justice Kavanaugh's accusers recently did. But let's assume the 2% figure is accurate, and let's work from there, applying a Bayesian analysis. For those of you who are not familiar with Bayes and Bayesian analysis, it requires that probabilities, like 2%, be adjusted as new information becomes available. So starting with the 2%, what adjustments should be made for several indisputable facts? What adjustment should be made for the fact that the former head of the FBI and his staff conducted a thorough investigation of the charges made against me and looked at all of my travel records, my phone records, and other records, and determined that it was impossible for me to have been on the Caribbean island, the New Mexico ranch, and other places during the time my accuser claimed to have sex with me. The former head of the FBI then concluded the allegations could not possibly be true. That raises the level from 2%, say, to maybe another 20%. Then we have the decision of the judge to strike the allegation and sanction the lawyers who made it. The lawyers then acknowledged that they made a mistake in making the charge, and the key lawyer admitted that his client misidentified me and was, quote, wrong, completely wrong. This surely adds another 20% to the 2%. Then we have the fact that my accuser provided a detailed account of meeting President Clinton, Vice President Gore, and Mrs. Gore on the same island where she said she encountered me. The problem is that the Secret Service records prove conclusively that neither Clinton nor the Gores ever set foot on that island. That surely raises the percentage, say, another 20%. Then we have recently discovered emails and a book, manuscript, by the accuser that proves conclusively that she and another person set out to frame me in order to earn a large amount of money. The accuser's best friend said that they were hoping to get $1 billion from the owner of Victoria's Secret and the Limited, too, by accusing him of precisely the same kind of acts they falsely accused me of. I think that probably represents the Bayesian probabilities, another 20%. Then there is the indisputable fact that my accuser deliberately lied about her age. Her employment records prove she was well above the age of consent when she falsely claimed she had consensual sex with me and others. They had another 5%. Finally, we have the fact that my accuser also accused former prime minister, a former senator, several president academics, businessmen, a prince, a president, all of whom have categorically and credibly denied the charges. This surely adds another 10%. So we're up to approximately 97% instead of 2% that the accusation against me was fabricated for false financial gain. Of course, the reality is that it's a zero-sum situation. Either I did or did not commit the act of rape against a woman who I never met and never heard of. The truth is that there is a 0 chance that I did and a 100% chance that she made up the entire story for money. This demonstrates the great dangers of using statistics such as the 2% statistic used in the leaflet. The 2% argument is precisely the same argument the Ku Klux Klan made to justify the execution and lynching of so many African American men during the past century who were falsely accused of raping white women. The Klan argued that white women must be believed when they accuse black men of rape. They too argued that only a tiny percentage of such accusations are false. Senator Joseph McCarthy made similar arguments when he accused innocent people of communist affiliation. Statistics alone must never, ever be used as a basis for concluding that a particular person is guilty or innocent of a particular crime. That is why our Constitution demands due process, an opportunity to confront witnesses, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and other safeguards. So shame on them who would convict people based on questionable statistics that aren't applicable to the particular case on issue. To say that all men who are accused or guilty of rape is very much the same as saying that no men who are accused of rape are guilty. They both engage in statistical false analysis. So every time a woman, like my accuser, tries to frame an innocent person for financial gain, it sets back the Me Too movement considerably. I'm a big supporter of the Me Too movement. I think it's done a great deal of good in sensitizing people to the extreme amount of rape and sexual assault that exists in college campuses and around the world. But every time a radical feminist issues a false accusation, as those who produced this pamphlet did, it puts an arrow through the heart of the important Me Too movement. So I think we should learn a very important lesson about due process and due process on campuses. And I want to devote the rest of my comments to what's going on college campuses today, not only here, but all over the country and indeed around the world. I want to focus both on due process and on freedom of speech. Again, I want to begin with a headline. The cowardly shootings that our nation witnessed in a synagogue and black churches, on a baseball diamond, along with the mailed pipe bombs, are extreme manifestations of a deeper, more pervasive attack on American values of tolerance, reasoned discussion, and nonviolence. Our core Constitution and political values are being challenged in many places by many people, but most dangerously by students and faculty leaders on university campuses today. These values include the free and open exchange of ideas, the right to hold and express views that offend some listeners, and the marketplace of ideas as a means of discerning truth. These values include truth as an end in and of itself, the need for diversity of ideas, due process and the presumption of innocence for those accused of misconduct, individual rather than identity accountability, and other traditional hallmarks of liberal democracy that are barriers to tyranny. In place of these proven protections, many students and faculty are insisting that freedom of speech is part of a patriarchal privilege designed to preserve the status quo, that truth is identity-based and variable. There's one truth for certain groups, another truth for others. That truth is what you feel, not what exists outside in the real world. That evidence is in the eye of the beholder. Who are you going to believe, as Groucho Marx asked rhetorically, me or your lying eyes? They insist that they know the truth, and they need not hear other views. That due process is a tactic for requiring the oppressed to prove their victimization. That identity politics must displace individualism. That academic construct, such as intersectionality, that teaches that all oppressed groups share common oppressors, demand accountability, and that democracy and liberty are constructs of hegemonic white male autocracy. Most frightening is the claim by some faculty members, I don't think it exists on this campus, but I can identify campuses on which it does exist, that violence is an acceptable tactic of change if democratic institutions do not produce the desired results. This is not the first time that faculty members around the country have advocated that. During the Vietnam War, we know bombs were planted at universities. Efforts were made to blow up laboratories. Efforts were made to kill American soldiers and policemen. And they were led by faculty members who are active in organizations such as the Weathermen. This is the current lingua franca of many educational discourses, not only on campuses, but in many classrooms, including required classes, where teachers do not any longer teach their students how to think, but instead teach their students what to think. And they teach captive audiences of students what to think, instead of to make up their own minds based on learning how to think. Worse, the attack is spreading beyond students to extremists on all sides of the political and ideological spectrum. Centrist liberalism and centrist conservatism. I stand for centralist liberalism. The institution that sponsored my event stands largely for centrist conservatism. We share a common commitment to the core values under attack. And these core values are being marginalized by extremists on both sides who used to dwell on the fringes of society. The political center today is shrinking, as many on the left move from liberalism toward misnamed progressivism that often espouses many regressive and intolerant elements, and as the right moves toward populism and, in some instances, outright white supremacy. It's a worldwide trend manifested by the rise of both the hard left and the hard right. Jeremy Corbyn in Great Britain represents the hard left of this trend, as do some recently elected Democratic politicians in our own country. The trend toward the hard right is represented by nationalistic leaders in countries like Hungary and Poland and Greece and Austria and Latvia and Lithuania and other European countries, as well as by some extremist Republican politicians. Here in the United States, we've been blessed with a constitutional system of checks and balances. This system of checks and balances constrains the excesses of either extreme. But the most important and powerful check has always remained with the people themselves. As the great Judge Learned Hand once wisely reminded us decades ago, quote, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it," which is what worries me so much about current trends among some students. Some students simply do not value liberty. Some students simply do not value due process. Students see the ends as justifying the means, and students are our future leaders. And I worry that if liberty and freedom of speech and due process dies in the hearts of today's students, they may not be revived in time when they become the leaders of our country. Our democratic system of checks and balances actually transcends what we learned about in civics or political science, transcends the three branches of government. Our system of checks and balances includes the media, the academy, business, religion, science, technology. For example, when President Trump, in a misguided act, decided to separate families at the border, the American people stood up and revolted. The business community said, no, we're not going to encourage this. The academic community, the religious community, Republicans as well as Democrats. These institutions coalesced to say to the president, no, you've gone too far. This is not what Americans do. We do not separate families. You have gone much too far. And President Trump did back off, perhaps only temporarily, but he did back off. Not enough, and to a considerable degree. He was responsive to the call of the people, and that, too, is a fundamental aspect of our system of checks and balances. Some of the media, as well, have prioritized ideology over truth, opinion over reporting, pandering over challenging. Lopsided news analysis appears on the front page of the New York Times next to all the news that selectively fits their narrative. Fox, CNN, MSNBC report the same facts differently. The media has become as adversarial as our legal system, but without judges, who are also becoming more adversarial. I remember the day when Walter Cronkite would report the news, and everybody accepted him. He didn't vote. He didn't take positions on politics. And when he said we had gone too far in Vietnam, the American people listened, and it had a big impact. Today, the media operates in silos. Fox people watch Fox, CNN people watch CNN, MSNBC people watch MSNBC, and it's very hard to find media that accurately reports with nuance all the developments. When I was younger, we used to be able to count on the American Civil Liberties Union as a defender of core fundamental civil liberties. I served on the national board of the ACLU for many years. I served along with Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. We shared in common a deep commitment to freedom of speech for all. You'd represent a communist today, a Nazi tomorrow, a pornographer, whatever. Whoever's free speech was being denied, the ACLU was there. Whoever's due process was being denied, the ACLU was there. Today, the ACLU has prioritized politics over principles and has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Look, we're very, very lucky. In our country, we've never really had the extremes that Europe experienced. In the 1920s, the economy began to collapse, first in Germany after they lost the First World War, and then the worldwide depression. The European response was to divide the countries into communists on the one hand and fascists on the other hand. The disputes in the late 20s and early 30s in all parts of Europe was between fascism and communism, not in the United States. In the United States, we had the New Deal. The New Deal was centrist Democrats trying to create safety nets for all Americans, for working class people. We resisted the temptations of extremism and moved toward the center. The question today is whether we have moved so much toward the extremes of right and left that it's going to be hard to move back. The concerning question is whether the current trends toward extremism and intolerance are wounding liberty in the hearts of our future leaders. Do we have the capacity to treat these wounds before they fester and become fatal? History has blessed this nation with a centrist approach to all these issues. In the United States, we have been far more fortunate than other parts of the world. Sure, we had our extremism. We had the Klan in the 1920s and 1930s. We had the Bund, which was a Nazi party in New York and other parts of the country. We had McCarthyism in the 1950s. I personally experienced McCarthyism. I was president of the student body at Brooklyn College when they were trying to fire professors because these professors had refused to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee or had invoked the Fifth Amendment. But we have never had these become mainstream. President Eisenhower stood up against McCarthyism. President Roosevelt stood up against communism and Nazism, whereas other presidents and other prime ministers and other leaders did not. President Trump was rightfully criticized for not condemning more forcefully the white supremacists who falsely claimed to be speaking in his name. So too must Democrats today and leaders be criticized for not condemning more forcefully those who distort liberalism into intolerant radicalism. So too should educational leaders condemn those who misuse their academic license to propagandize rather than to teach, who tell their students, as I said, what to think instead of how to think. Too many mainstream Democrats have remained silent, even complicit with the anti-Semitic and anti-gay incitements of Louis Farrakhan, along with some of his bigoted followers on many university campuses. Today, Farrakhan is in Iran, shouting death to America, shouting that Judaism is a gutter religion and satanic, shouting all these curses against gay and lesbian Americans. And yet, people on the left meet with him. The Black Caucus has met with him. President Bill Clinton, who is my friend and who I support and admire, did not walk out when Farrakhan was seated next to him at Aretha Franklin's memorial service. Imagine how different the situation would have been. I'm a law professor, so I come up with hypotheticals. Imagine the hypothetical if one of President Clinton's country and Western people who he admired had died, and there was a memorial service, And he came to the memorial service to say nice things about his friend, who was a great country and western singer, and he sees sitting 2 seats next to him David Duke, who it turns out, unbeknownst to President Clinton, was a friend of this country and western singer. Is there anyone in this room who believes that President Clinton would have stayed one moment and sat next to David Duke? Of course not. And yet he stayed and sat next to Louis Farrakhan. To her credit, his daughter, Chelsea, condemned Farrakhan, but we haven't heard enough. We haven't heard it from President Obama. We haven't heard it from other leading Democrats. You must have zero tolerance for bigotry, whatever its source, whether it comes from the left or whether it comes from the right. The shootings that we saw in the synagogue, the pipe bombs, they're symptoms. They're symptoms of a deeper underlying sickness in our system. But the root causes include a growing intolerance of both sides of the political spectrum. That such intolerance is being taught to our future leaders, who are now students, should frighten us even more than the shootings and the pipe bombs. Now, there's good news. The good news is that there's pushback from some students and faculty. That on university campuses today, you see students organizing against the repression of the hard left and the supremacy of the hard right. Yes, we're seeing it, but we're seeing it in some respects growing out of self-interest. Today on many college campuses, the leaders of the opposition to censorship are conservative students. Why? A, because they principally believe in it. It's a matter of principle, but also it's self-serving. Because the people who are mostly repressed on university campus today are conservatives. And so it's in the self-interest of conservatives to speak out on college campuses. You know, I'm often asked the following question. Many observers have noted that the extreme left is now on the forefront of seeking censorship on university campuses. And the question that I'm asked is, when did that change? My answer is, there has been no change. The hard left has never supported free speech. Now, you'll answer and say, but my God, during McCarthyism, the left supported free speech. Of course, because it was free speech for me, but not for thee. It was the hard left that was being victimized by censorship. You'll say, but what about the great free speech movement at Berkeley? I was there. I remember it. Mario Savio had no interest in conservatives having free speech. He was only seeking free speech for the hard left. Free speech has become tragically a tactic of extremists on both sides. Free speech for me, but not for thee. The critical issue always has to be, do you pass the shoe on the other foot test? What is the shoe on the other foot test? It's simple. It's a political application of the golden rule. And that is, would you be making the same arguments that you're making today if the shoe were on the other foot? If the people who were being victimized were your political enemies instead of your political friends? I've written about this issue on several occasions. I started writing about it after Bush versus Gore was decided. Remember Bush versus Gore, 2000? The Supreme Court ended the recount and, using very questionable constitutional arguments, basically handed the presidency over to George Bush. Now, he may have won anyway, and he might have won legitimately. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Supreme Court decision. And so I wrote a book called Supreme Injustice, where I argued that the 5 justices failed the shoe on the other foot test. If the case had been Gore versus Bush, not Bush versus Gore, and if it were Gore who was trying to stop the recount, I honestly believe that the 5 justices, or at least several of them, would have voted differently. I then applied the shoe on the other foot test recently to the Kavanaugh hearings. You may remember that about 1,000 law professors wrote a very, very intelligent and thoughtful and compelling letter to Congress, particularly to the Senate, in which they said, look, we're people of all different backgrounds and people of all different views, but we share together the view that Justice Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh then, doesn't belong on the Supreme Court because he showed a lack of judicial temperament. He showed that he could get angry. He showed that he wanted to get even with the Democrats. And they wrote a very, very, very compelling analysis of that. But then I asked the shoe on the other foot question. What if, again, I'm a law professor, I use hypotheticals. What if the candidate were a gay woman liberal Democrat who had been appointed by a president who wanted to shift the Supreme Court away from conservatism toward liberalism? And what if this woman, this middle-aged woman, had been accused of sexual assault when she was 17 years old? And what if she testified in front of the Senate and was furious and angry and injudicious, as probably any of us would be if we were falsely accused? I asked the question, how many of the 1,000 professors who wrote this brilliant letter would have signed that equally brilliant letter against her nomination? My conclusion was few, if any. And so I concluded that these professors did not pass the shoe on the other foot test. Now, am I making an argument ad hominem? Am I making an argument that says you look at the quality of an argument based on who said it? We all know that's a deep fallacy. No. I'm saying if you're crediting the argument because of who said it, there are 1,000 law professors who said this. If the first 1,000 people from the Boston phone book had said it, we wouldn't be crediting the argument. But if you're making an ad hominem argument in support of a position, then you have to ask the question, would the people on the list have passed the shoe on the other foot test? And I think often the answer to that is no. So where are we? Where are we today? We live in the most extremely divided age in my lifetime, in my experience. More divided than during the Vietnam War, more divided than during McCarthyism. Look, every decade that I've lived in has had crises. 110,000 Japanese Americans put in concentration camps during the 1940s when I was a child, McCarthyism in the 50s, the Vietnam War, terrorism. We've always had crises, but I've never seen our country as ideologically divided as it is today. People just don't talk to each other. People refuse to engage. People obviously walk out. That's their right. They are protesting me. But people aren't listening to each other. Will it get better? Will it get worse? Nobody knows the answer to that question. But I can tell you where the answer lies, not what the answer is. And the answer lies in universities like Colgate. Universities that are on the forefront of educating students. Universities that will produce our future leaders. You know, when I used to teach first-year students at Harvard Law School, there'd be 150 students in the class, and they'd be nervous because I was a Socratic teacher, and I'd ask hard questions, and I had a reputation. There was never a right answer in my class. Every answer had to get a different answer. And the students would be very nervous on the first day, and they would look around, and I would look at these 150 students. I wouldn't just see 150 faces of young, scared students. I would see the next president of the United States. I would see the next editor-in-chief of the New York Times. I would see the next chief counsel of Goldman Sachs. I would see the next Chief Justice of the United States. Why would I see them? Because they all passed through my classes. Because I knew I was teaching the future leaders of America. And your teachers are teaching the future leaders of America. You here today are our future leaders. And it's so important that you proselytize on behalf of the Bill of Rights, that you proselytize on behalf of freedom of speech, that you argue compellingly for why it is so important and so imperative that we defend the rights of those we disagree with. Free speech for thee as well as for me. Due process for thee as well as for me. You might not like what the person's accused of. Today, the person who's accused is accused of being a rapist. Tomorrow, the person accused might be a woman who was accused of making a false accusation of rape. That test, the criteria must be the same. We can't have different criteria depending on the nature of the accusation. We can't have different criteria based on whether the accuser is a man and the accuser is a woman, or vice versa, or the accuser is black or white or gay or straight. We have to have a single standard, and I know that this great university has had debates and has come up with standards for free speech and for due process, and I commend you for that. Look, we live in difficult times. The Chinese curse is, may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times, but we have an obligation. We have an obligation to our future. We have an obligation to the generations that are coming after us. We have an obligation to the history of America, which for 225 or more years has been a beacon of light. We have the oldest continuing constitution in the history of the world, and we can't tamper with it. The President of the United States can't suddenly announce that if you're born in this country and have lived under its jurisdiction, he can issue an edict or a mandate saying you're not a citizen. Conservatives are supposed to read the Constitution literally. Read the Constitution. The Constitution says if you're born here and you're under the jurisdiction of the United States, you are a citizen and nobody can take that citizenship away from you. The Constitution talks about freedom of speech and due process and the right to confront witnesses. We may not find that convenient, and it's inconvenient. Often it's very inconvenient because it results in guilty people going free, but our Constitution basically is premised on the notion, better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly convicted. That's a difficult notion to live with. We don't want to see guilty people go free. We would like to live in a perfect world where only the innocent are convicted and only the innocent are acquitted and only the guilty are convicted. We're humans. We don't live in that world. You know, there's a fascinating story in the Bible where Abraham meets God. And within a short time after meeting him, he's yelling at him. He's saying, God, how dare you? You've told me you're going to sweep away the innocent with the guilty. You're going to kill all the people of Sodom. How dare you? It would be unjust of you. It would be sacrilegious of you. Imagine Abraham accusing God of sacrilegion, of immorality, because he was going to sweep away the guilty along with the innocent. And then Abraham, the world's first lawyer, negotiates with God and says, what if I can find 50 righteous people? Will you spare the other people? And God says, all right, if you can find 50, fine. And then Abraham, who knows how to negotiate, says, but for the lack of 10, would you kill all these people? What if I can only find 40? What if I can find 30? What if I can find 20? He finally gets God down to 10. And God says, if you can find 10 righteous people, I will spare the city. But he can't find 10 righteous people. And then Abraham walks away. He doesn't argue for 5. Now, why doesn't he argue for 5? Because Abraham and God are talking about learning about human justice. What God says to Abraham in the beginning of the story is, shall I withhold from my servant Abraham what I am about to do to the cities of Sodom? No, he must learn how to do human justice. So why are we prepared to allow 5 righteous people to be wrongly convicted in order to do justice? Because we don't live in a perfect world. You can never get perfection. That's why we say 10 guilty. We don't say 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000. We say 10. We can live with that. We can live with mistakes. We can live with imperfections. We can live with what due process and freedom of speech produces. And we have to always remember that freedom of speech is not free. Freedom of speech is very expensive. When you allow freedom of speech to tolerate hate speech, you're causing an enormous amount of harm. The question is it worth it? And the question is, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are to give the government the power to determine what is hate speech and what is not hate speech, what is permissible and what is not permissible. I always have the Martin Luther King test. When people say, can't you stop Nazis from marching through Skokie? Nazis are bad people. I say, how do you come up with a rule that prevents Nazis from marching through Skokie without preventing Martin Luther King from marching through Birmingham? Because you can't say Martin Luther King's good and Nazis are bad. That's not what the Constitution permits. You have to have one rule for all people. So I commend you for enduring the inconvenience of having protests and people walking out. I hope that we will be able to continue this conversation in a constructive way. I welcome your questions on any subject, and they needn't be questions, they can be statements. I look forward to tough questions, probing questions. Please ask me anything you would like to, and I hope that in the end we can learn together. Thank you very much.
Okay, at this time, if you're interested in asking a question or making a statement to Professor Dershowitz, I invite you to come up if you're on this side to share my microphone, and if you're on that side, come up to Professor Carolyn Giles' microphone, and let's start the conversation.
And if there are any of the protesters who are listening from outside, I welcome you back. Even if you didn't listen to my speech, I welcome you back to ask me hard questions. I will take your questions as well.
Okay, so you want to just say your name?
Yeah. I'm Chase. Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering what are your go-to nonpartisan news platforms?
Boy, that's a hard question. I'm a voracious reader, so I just read everything. I start out in the morning reading the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. I don't read everything, obviously. I skim through them and look at my the news that is most important to me. I then usually go to The Guardian in London. Sometimes I go to Haaretz in Israel. I wish I read more languages. I don't. So I have to limit myself to 7 or 8 media. I don't watch a lot of news on television. Certainly not the 24-hour cable cycles, because it's just repetitive. And in the end, I've lived long enough to try to make up my own mind. And I'm probably wrong as often as I'm right.
Next question.
Yes, thank you for coming, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your talk, and I thought it was very informative. I have a question not exactly related to it. It's about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Sure.
And I was just wondering, how would you implement the two-state solution? How would you work out a solution that both sides could possibly agree with? Because there's a lot of hatred on both sides. There's a lot of distrust. What would you want to do to...
Well, let's start just with a little bit of history. In 1938, the Peel Commission offered the Palestinians a state on what would be about 80% of what is now Israel-Palestine. And the Palestinian side said, no, we don't want a state. We just don't want there to be a Jewish state. 1948, the UN, 47-48, offered the Palestinians a state on a majority of the arable land of what is now Palestine, Israel, and the Israelis said yes, and the Palestinians attacked Israel along with all the Arab countries and said no. In 1967, when Israel won the '67 war, the Israelis were waiting by the telephone to give back the West Bank in exchange simply for peace under UN resolution that was passed right after the end of the war. In 2000 and 2001, Prime Minister Ehud Barak and President Clinton offered the Palestinians 90% of the West Bank, a capital in Jerusalem, a symbolic right of return. The Palestinians said no and started the Intifada. In 2005, Israel unilaterally left the Gaza and took 9,000 settlers out of the Gaza and offered them an opportunity to build a Singapore on the Mediterranean. And instead, they used all the money they got from Europe to build rockets and terror tunnels. And in 2008, Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians a state, an even more generous one that had been offered by Bill Clinton, and there was no positive response. So it's going to be difficult. I have been working with the current White House, as I have with previous White Houses, on trying to come up with a plan that would be acceptable to both sides. I think the plan would look something like this. I'm not disclosing what's been negotiated or what's been discussed in the White House, but generally what everybody thinks has to happen. The Israelis have to allow the Palestinians to have a state on most of the West Bank. The areas that are now filled with Israelis have to be traded for equivalent land so that the amount of land the Palestinians have is equivalent to the amount of land they had before the 1967 war. They would have a symbolic right of return where families could be reunified. They would have a capital in Jerusalem along with the Israeli capital in Jerusalem, and the state would not be a state that could have an air force or an army. It would have to be a demilitarized state. Those are the elements, and I've met with Abbas and discussed those elements with him. I've met repeatedly with Netanyahu and discussed those elements with him, and they are not as far apart as people think. If they could only come to the negotiating table and stop the politics and become statesmen rather than politicians, I really do think the elements that would lead to a two-state solution are there, and it would be a win-win for the Palestinians, a win-win for the Israelis, a win-win for peace, a win-win for the Sunni coalition against Iran. And I think, imagine the peace dividend if Israelis and Palestinians could work together and really literally turn their swords into plowshares and their nuclear weapons into nuclear medicine.
Question from your side.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, thank you. Professor Dershowitz, what would you say in response to those who would say that the world that you present in your speech perhaps lacks a bit of nuance, in that I think that both sides, right, liberals or far left or conservatives, both agree that free speech and due process are, like, on face good things, but it's just the current manifestations of free speech and due process that may be harmful. For instance, there are those who would argue that the justice system in its current iteration has a lot of sexism or racism embedded within its structures that prevents certain demographics, certain groups from achieving solvency under the current systems. And therefore, we need to approach these systems and not take them for granted, but need to approach them with some skepticism and perhaps reject some of their findings from time to time. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I think that's right. Look, we're never going to get a perfect end to racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, everything else. But think of how much progress we've made, even in your lifetime, and you're so young. But think back just 20 years. We have constitutional right for gays to marry. We're not going to see an overruling of Roe versus Wade, I believe. I do think that there's been a lot of progress in franchising larger elements of people. I think we're opening up universities to people of many more economic and ethnic and other backgrounds. We've made progress, and we make progress without violence through democratic means. I agree with you. The system of justice still has real elements of racism in it. The number of African-American men confined in prison is unacceptable, and we have to keep fighting. And we win. We lose sometimes, but we win. But the alternative of using violence to achieve these results will only achieve much more dangerous outcomes.
Next question from the side.
So earlier it was mentioned that you defended OJ during his infamous
That's right.
trial in the 90s. And so I wanted to know if there was any similarities between defending OJ and President Trump today, and if their individual level of fame affected the operation of the case itself.
Well, it's a good question. Of course, OJ was charged with a double murder, and when I first became involved in the case, was facing the death penalty. It's interesting how we won the OJ case. We didn't win, the other side lost. And many of you are too young to remember the case, but you may have seen some of the movies. Let me describe to you how we won the case, and it's really, really interesting. Let's see if I can, is there a bottle? Yeah, there's a bottle of water up here. Okay, so when I first got into the case, my job was the forensic job. I do a lot of work on science and law. And we discovered that the police had found 2 socks of OJ's, and the socks had on it the blood of OJ and the blood of his victims. What could be a more compelling piece of evidence? How could you ever acquit somebody if a sock belonging to OJ had his blood and the blood of the victims? It's an open and shut case. Here's the problem. The sock did have the blood of the victims. Now, if he was running through a field of blood and blood splattered on his sock, So you'd have the blood on the outside, right? You'd have a mirror image of the blood on the inside. But then on the third side and the fourth side, separated by the leg, you wouldn't have a mirror image. You would have what's called a crystallized transfer, because the blood from the second part of the sock would have dried by the time it was taken off because the leg was in it. Well, when we looked at the sock, we saw 4 mirror image blood splatters on all 4 sides of the sock. That made us think very hard, and we went back and we checked the blood on the sock. And the blood on the sock, and only the blood on the sock, had a chemical called EDTA, which is an anticoagulant that is not found in the human body. If you had it in your body, you die, because it would be like rat poison. But it is found in test tubes, because it prevents the blood from coagulating, the plasma separating from. And so we were able to prove conclusively that 2 police officers, we named them, we identified them, had taken home the blood of all 3 and had poured them on the sock in order to frame a guilty man. That is, they believed O.J. Simpson was guilty. They believed he might get away with it because the glove that was found might be suppressed. And so they enhanced the evidence by pouring blood from a test tube onto the sock. So we persuaded the jury that the police had tampered with a sock. And so the jury, there were 3 groups in the jury. One group said, oh, if the police tampered with one piece of evidence, they must have tampered with all the evidence, so we can't trust all the evidence. They voted to acquit. A second group said, no, 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 no. We think they only tampered with this piece of evidence, and we think the other evidence is legitimate, and we think he did it. But we don't think we should reward the police for having tampered with evidence. We have to show them that they can't get away with that. So that group voted to acquit. And then there was a third group, unfortunately, that simply said, African Americans, who said, look, we've had enough African American men convicted, too many white people freed, the system is racist to its core, we're just not going to convict. And so you had 3 groups coming to 3 different means of achieving that result. I'm curious how you in the audience would deal with that. If you were convinced of 2 things, 1, O.J. Simpson did it, B, the police planted evidence that was illegitimate in order to prove that he did it. If you believe both of those facts, how many of you would vote to convict? How many of you would vote to acquit? I guess we have a hung jury. Okay. The O.J. Simpson situation is very different, of course, than Donald Trump. O.J. Simpson is a criminal defendant. He's entitled to be represented. I was one of his lawyers. I have a 6th Amendment obligation to defend him. I have no obligation to defend Donald Trump. One of the reasons that I'm making the case for him is because I believe in the Constitution. I'll show you something interesting. So, let's go back 2 years to now. 2 years to now, I was planning a celebration in my house. I had all my friends coming over to celebrate Hillary Clinton's victory. It was inevitable. She was going to win, and it would be fine. And the Republicans were already saying, on the day that she is sworn in, we're going to impeach her because of her emails and other things. And we're going to prosecute her. Remember, at the convention, they were yelling, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. So at that point, I decided to write a book called The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. In fact, to demonstrate that later, my publisher came up. This is the cover of my actual book that I wrote. It's called The Case Against Impeaching Trump. But my publisher came up with this cover, The Case Against Impeaching Clinton. But I didn't write this book because she didn't get elected. But I wrote exactly the same book. The content is almost identical. I make all the same arguments. But as the result of it being the case against impeaching Trump instead of the case against impeaching Clinton, I am now a pariah in liberal circles, including a place where I've spent 50 years, Martha's Vineyard, where my friends, after being friends with them for 30, 40, 50 years, many of them won't talk to me. So my publisher came up with a third cover And the third cover is a plain brown wrapper, so you can read my book on the beach of Martha's Vineyard without anybody knowing you're reading my book. And that's where we've come to. It is absolutely remarkable. So, you know, I'm going to stick to my principles. I'm going to keep writing books about what I believe. Sometimes they will help Trump, sometimes they will hurt Trump, sometimes they will help the Democrats, sometimes they will hurt him. But I will always ask myself whether I pass the shoe on the other foot test. And if I don't, I'm not going to make the argument. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz.
Hi.
So I know you talked a little bit about, in your talk, about the variations in free speech, especially on college campuses, and you even complimented Colgate for our level of free speech on our campus. And I was wondering what you think some of the factors are that affect the variation in different college campuses and the level of free speech that's accepted there.
Well, first of all, not all speech is permissible either under the First Amendment or Colgate's a private university. It's not bound by the First Amendment, but it wants to obviously have the open marketplace of ideas. But a professor, for example, teaching a class can't turn to a woman and use a negative word, or a black person, or a Jew. You can't do that. Or you can't say to a woman, no, I'm not going to call on you because women aren't smart enough. Although a professor at Columbia did the following. Called on a student. Student answered with an Israeli accent. The professor, Professor Joseph Massad, said to the student, according to reports of students who were there, are you an Israeli? The student said yes. Were you in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces? The student said yes. And the professor said, you cannot speak in my class unless you're willing to publicly admit that you're a war criminal. Now, that's not permissible, free speech. It's not permissible for a professor to do what a professor at University of Michigan did last month, saying, I'm going to recommend you. You want to take a year abroad. You're a great student. I'm going to recommend you. Oh, you want to spend a year abroad in Israel? No, I'm not going to recommend you for that because I believe in boycotting Israel. Well, you're a professor, and you have to write recommendations based on the quality of the student. So rules in universities are different. A student can't disrupt the classroom. A teacher can't use comments that are racially or gender inappropriate. And there are different rules inside the classroom and outside the classroom. A professor outside the classroom should be able to say anything they please, no matter how stupid it is. And believe me, you read some of the things that professors say all over the country, they are unbelievable. But they're entitled to do that because they don't have a captive audience. They're just outside the class. In the classroom, I think the rules are quite different. And we haven't yet figured out what the comparative free speech rights of the professor and the students are. Remember, academic freedom applies not only to the professor, but the student. Now, I don't think a professor should have the right to grade down a student who disagrees with the professor on some political or ideological issue. So the areas of what is free speech, what is not on a campus, very complicated, very difficult. I know that Colgate is grappling with these issues, and I think you'll come to some good answers because I have a lot of faith in your faculty, your president, and your student body. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. What? Oh, hi. Oh, sorry. You're holding it. What is the philosophical foundation or of the concept that somehow the Constitution, written back, in the 1770s, 1780s, by a bunch of brilliant men, should somehow be interpreted back as if they were still alive and we were still living in a world when there was no electricity and there was only a few, maybe 100,000 people living in the eastern coast, and England and Spain and France were the major power, well, Netherlands, sure, et cetera.
What you're asking is the hardest constitutional question about, and we have distinguished professors of constitutional law here, how do you interpret a 225-year-old document? And I think there are different means for different parts of the Constitution. There are certain parts of the Constitution that, in Justice Scalia's terms, are dead. They're dead. They are not subject to any interpretation. You have to be 35 years old to run for president. That doesn't mean that if you're a 34-year-old with a brilliant IQ and incredible maturity that you can run for president. No, you can't. You have to wait until you're 35. That part of the Constitution is dead. You cannot change it at all. Contrast that with the words due process of law. Contrast that with terms equal protection of the law, cruel and unusual punishments. These are terms that cry out for interpretation, and for interpretations that you can ask the question, what would the brilliant framers, what would the writers of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton, Jay, Madison, how would they deal with the problems of the internet? How would they deal with GPSs that can trace your every movement? And the justices and judges have to extrapolate what they believe the principles underlying the constitutional provisions are and how you apply those principles. Take, for example, the issue of abortion. Nobody thought about that issue at the time of the Constitution. And people say, oh, the Constitution doesn't include the right of privacy. Well, of course not. There was no such word, privacy. Privacy doesn't enter the dictionary until some 30 or 40 years after the Constitution is written. But there was another word that meant the same thing, the word security. And the security of the people. The security appears in the Constitution. It appears in statutes. So it's just a myth to say that the framers didn't think about privacy. The Fourth Amendment's all about privacy. The Third Amendment, nobody today ever looks at the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment's all about privacy. It's you can't quarter troops in your own house unless during times of war. Why? Because your home was your castle. And the government was not allowed to take over your home. Privacy, privacy, but it wasn't called privacy, it was called security. So you have to be both a literalist and somebody who believes in interpretation. There's no such thing as people who believe in a living constitution, a dead constitution for all purposes. Even Scalia, he wrote the decision, Scalia, about the GPS and how the framers would have handled the GPS. He wrote the decision where they had heat detectors to try to detect who was growing marijuana in their houses, and Justice Scalia wrote the decision saying that would not have been permitted by the framers. They didn't know anything about heat detection, they didn't know anything about marijuana, but they knew a lot about homes and what you're entitled to get from a home without probable cause and without a warrant. So, there's never going to be a perfect solution. Justice Scalia was a friend of mine, and I argued with him all the time about his originalism, and in the end, he said to me, look, originalism has its problems. The best I can say for it, it's the least worst of all the other methods of interpretation. And my own view is a mixed view. You have to have originalism for certain parts of the Constitution. You have to have more living Constitution for other parts of the Constitution. And we'll never have a perfect solution.
Carolyn, on your side, do you have a question?
Is there anyone over here who wants to come up? No?
Okay, I guess
you must have some tougher questions for me, folks. Come on, a little bit of contentiousness here. A little bit of bring it on. Come on. Ask me about what you're really thinking.
That one over here.
Yeah.
This is not directly related to the talk, but when it was in the making, what were your thoughts on the JCPOA?
On?
The Iran nuclear deal.
Oh, I wrote a book called The Case Against the Iran Deal. And so my views are very clear. Though I wasn't sure that I agreed with the president tearing it up completely, I thought perhaps it would be better if he sat down and negotiated. But then I learned that his method of negotiation is to tear up the deal and say, if you want to negotiate, let's negotiate from scratch. And so, I was against the deal, and I hope that maybe President Trump can negotiate a better deal that would stop the Iranians from developing nuclear, carrying missiles that can carry nuclear weapons, and also stopping doing certain things that they're now doing that encourage terrorism around the world. So I'm hopeful. Yeah.
Professor Dershowitz, I want to thank you again for taking time to come speak with college students in lieu of your regularly scheduled airtime with one Anderson Cooper. So my question for you is, in about 24 hours' time, I and many others in this room will have cast our ballots in the midterms. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the implications of a potential impeachment of President Trump and sort of the legal and constitutional aspects of that should Democrats take both the House and the Senate tomorrow night.
No good would come from impeaching President Trump, except my book would be a bestseller. That's not a good enough reason to impeach President Trump. I don't believe President Trump will be impeached. If the Democrats take control of the House, people like Maxine Waters and others who, by the way, want to impeach not only President Trump but Vice President Pence as well, they'll make a lot of noise, they'll introduce resolutions, but in the end the Democrats are too smart to make the mistake the Republicans made when they impeached Clinton. Because they can't remove him. They're not going to get 2/3 of the Senate. So all we're going to get is some kind of a show trial. It will embolden the base, I think, of the other side. So I don't think it's going to happen. I've already voted. I vote in Florida. So I voted by absentee ballot. I voted Democrat. I want to see the checks and balances operate. I want to see the House taken by Democrats. And I think that will be better for the country. That's my own view. Having one House at least under the control of a different party. I think I would take that position generally, whether it's Republican or Democrat, shoe on the other foot. I think it's always better to have a divided system of governance than all of the institutions of government in one hand. But I also don't think we can predict the outcome of an election. I think since Trump, who was a new phenomenon in politics, polls have become far less reliable. And I think a lot of people don't tell the truth to pollsters, are embarrassed that they support Trump, and he always seems to get more votes than the polls suggest he's going to get. Although we have to remember that he lost the popular vote and that Hillary Clinton got the second largest number of votes for president of any person in the history of the United States, second only to Barack Obama in his second time that he ran. But she got it, look, there are more people in the country too, so that's not a completely true statistic. But, she won the popular vote, but the Electoral College is what prevails. And I think President Trump has a point when he says, look, I might have won the popular vote if there were no Electoral College. He would have campaigned in California, he would have campaigned in New York, he might have increased his vote. So it's not fair. It's like saying at the end of a soccer game, oh yeah, sure, one team had one goal and the other had no goals, but the team that had no goals had 17 more shots on goal. That should count. No, that's not the rule. The rule is the Electoral College, and so we have to live by that rule. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Professor Dershowitz. I just had a quick question about, there seems to be a lot of, I had a quick question about indicting a sitting president.
Yeah.
So if Mueller does find Trump committed X crime and he wants, what is the debate about can we indict a sitting president about, and where do you stand on that issue?
Well, I don't think you can indict a sitting president. I think the Constitution is very clear that you can only indict a president after the president has been impeached and removed or leaves office. It doesn't say that in the Constitution, but if you read the text surrounding impeachment, it certainly leads to that conclusion. That conclusion was agreed to by the Justice Department. They have a ruling saying you can't indict a sitting president, but some of my friends disagree. My colleague Larry Tribe thought you couldn't indict a sitting president when Bill Clinton was president, but he has now evolved and thinks you can indict a sitting president now that Trump's the president. I have not evolved. My views have remained exactly the same. So I don't think you can indict a sitting president. I also don't think the president has committed any crimes. I don't know all the evidence, but I don't think you can commit a crime by firing somebody who you're entitled to fire under Article 2 of the Constitution. I don't think you can commit a crime for simply exercising your authority under Article 2. So I haven't seen the evidence that would justify a crime. And I do think, and people disagree with this, but in my book I argue that to be impeached and removed, you have to commit treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and those terms mean something. You can't just remove a president because you don't like his policies or because it's maladministration of office. That was actually proposed and rejected at the Constitutional Convention.
Next question.
Professor Dershowitz, thank you for your words. My question's about an incident that recently happened on campus.
Sure.
Posters went around campus claiming it's okay to be white. Clearly a neo-Nazi slogan, it's anti-Semitic, it's racist. They were taken down. At what point should an institution step in? Where's that line? And at what point do we hold an institutional responsibility to stand up for marginalized groups as opposed to an individual action and response?
Okay, I think the use of the term marginalized groups is what creates the problem. I think the university has to be equal to all groups. And it has to have one single standard of when it will take down posters. This is a private university, so it's entitled to ban all posters. It won't do it, but it's entitled to, constitutionally. But I do think that whatever the rule is for posters that are offensive to people on the left have to be the same for posters that are offensive to people on the right. You need a kind of circle of civility. Again, it's an application of the shoe on the other foot test. You can't have affirmative action when it comes to free speech. You can't have less free speech for whites than for blacks, for women than for men, for gays than for straight people. The rules have to be identical. And we can't have one system that says, oh, this is an oppressed people, so they're entitled to say things that other people would not be entitled to say. This comes up a lot in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, where anti-Israel people are prepared to say the worst things about Zionists, about Jews, about Israel, but if somebody ever were to make any comparable statement about Muslims or Muslim countries, they would not be permitted to do it. The internet also doesn't have fair, symmetrical approaches. They do have affirmative action, which gives more leverage or leeway to people who are perceived to be oppressed than people who are perceived to be the oppressors. I don't think that's within the spirit of the First Amendment. I don't think it's within the spirit of academic freedom. So whatever the rule is for any group, the same rule has to apply to other groups.
Do you have people over on your side?
You want over here?
We have 4 people over here. It doesn't really. Okay.
We've got one here.
I hope we have a chance for everyone. Maybe if we, I don't know.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We talked a bit about the Constitution and about elections. So do you think the Electoral College is an ancient system?
What? Do I think what?
The Electoral College, is it an ancient system of electing the president, or does it still have legitimacy behind it?
It's a very hard question. The Electoral College is part of a series of compromises that can't be looked at individually. So, for example, look at the United States Senate. The same number of senators from Wyoming as from California, which means that every Wyoming has, 25, 30 times as much political influence through the Senate as a Californian, but that's not really what happens in practice. So, you know, to look at the Electoral College in isolation is probably a mistake. The Electoral College used to serve a legitimate purpose because we were not a democracy. The great election of, is it 18, I'm trying to say 1820, so who's the historians here? When John Quincy Adams, the prince, ran against Andrew Jackson, the interloper, and Andrew Jackson got...
1826.
1824? 20, okay.
I'm a student, 1824.
He ran twice. And the first time he ran, Andrew Jackson got 25% more votes than John Quincy Adams. But the electors thought that Andrew Jackson would make a terrible president, and so the electors decided to hand the presidency over to John Quincy Adams. Jackson then ran on that issue the next time and won so overwhelmingly that the electors had to make him be president. But the other point that's interesting, in that election, I think a total of 150,000 Americans voted. There were 10 million Americans. 150,000 voted. Why? You had to be white. You had to be male. You had to own property. In some states, you had to be a Protestant, not only a Christian. You couldn't be a Catholic, a Protestant. And so a tiny, tiny fraction of Americans voted. So in addition to the Electoral College, we had the electoral people themselves, who were a kind of mini Electoral College, because only a small percentage of them actually voted. Look, I think if I were rewriting the Constitution now, I'd probably not have the Electoral College, probably have a popular vote for president, but to just wrench it out of the constitutional context alone might exacerbate some of the problems we now have. But all things being equal, I think the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness.
Next question.
So this kind of bases off a prior question about free speech and hate speech. So I overall agree with your ideology about putting your shoe on another foot. Well, I don't know if I can necessarily apply it to an accusatory situation. I find it valuable in the examples you pose regarding the Supreme Court. My question, however, is when is the time to differentiate between hate speech and free speech? More specifically, when can language be considered structurally violent, if at all, in your opinion? And when is the idea of what we can say disregarded and you can actually consider the words violent crimes?
Okay, it's so interesting. One of my prized possessions is I own a letter, the actual letter written by Thomas Jefferson to a member of Congress on July 4th, the evening of July 4th, 1801, the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And the letter is in response to a statement made by a minister in a church in Connecticut saying that anybody who preaches violence should be prosecuted. And Jefferson was asked his opinion, and he writes this brilliant letter about why you don't prosecute the advocacy of violence, you prosecute the violence itself. And I was so taken by the letter when I bought it that I bought it on a Friday. By Monday I had written 12,000 words, and by the following 2 weeks I had finished a book. I wrote a book called Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson. I found his letter, I framed it, and I hung it. So it's all about Jefferson's letter, but it's all about this issue. And the issue hasn't changed at all. And what the Supreme Court has tried to do over the last 100 years, really, is come up with a distinction between advocacy of violence, which is protected by the Constitution, and incitement to violence, which is not protected. Now, that's not hard when you're dealing with a face-to-face audience. If I started to scream to you, kill that guy, kill that guy, kill him now, kill him now, that would be incitement to violence, and that could actually cause you to get up and do that. It's hard to incite violence in writing because you have the distance between yourself and the reader. Now the question is, what about the internet? The internet is like halfway between writing and speaking. And so the criteria is the same. Incitement can be criminalized, advocacy can't, but how you define incitement has really been a daunting question for the Supreme Court. And we're not going to be able to answer that question except on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
I'm not understanding how you can treat all cases of sexual assault the same when the issue so disproportionately affects groups of people. Also, I'm not understanding how you can be against sexual assault but not believe all survivors.
How can anybody, first of all, you beg the question. You say believe survivors. The question is she a survivor, or is she a woman like the woman in the Kavanaugh case who simply decided to make up a story? Is my accuser a survivor, or is she, or am I the survivor? Why not believe me? I'm the victim. I was the victim of a false accusation. False accusations are prohibited not only by the law but by the Ten Commandments. So why do you assume that anybody who calls themselves a survivor is actually a survivor rather than somebody who simply made up the allegation? I don't treat them all the same. That's exactly my point. I treat them all differently. Every accusation must be evidence-based. There is no gene that is sex-linked for telling the truth. There's no reason to believe a woman over a man, ever, under any circumstances, or a man over a woman, or a black person over a white person, or a white person over a black person, or a gay person over a straight person. There's simply no basis for identity politics having anything to do with the truth. And so you take every case, you listen carefully, you never ignore, you take them all seriously, you investigate thoroughly. That's why I support the Me Too movement. I think it's really important that every allegation of sexual assault be investigated carefully, but you have to look at the facts of every case. And you can't just do a statistical analysis, as I tried to demonstrate in the beginning of my talk. I want to give you a chance to respond to that. So, if you choose to. Okay, thank you.
In the age of the internet, a lie can spread to an audience of such a grand scale in ways it couldn't historically. Print, radio, and TV distribution used to provide guardrails on free speech that limited its scope, providing opportunity for rebuttal and reflection. Do you think that this widespread scope affects the role of free speech in our society? And do you think free speech should adopt to the modern communication era at all?
It's a perfect question. I think the answer is yes. Yes. I think free speech has to adapt to the realities of the internet. You're absolutely right. Winston Churchill said that a lie makes its way halfway around the world before the truth could put its pants on. And we know that, and that was before the internet. Just in my case, for example, when I was accused, it was on the front page of virtually every newspaper because I was accused along with Prince Andrew, the Prince of England. So I got second billing, but it was all over the place. And then when I was found that it wasn't true, the story appeared on page 23 of the newspaper. So, that's the reality, that a story, an accusation is always going to get more attention. It's going to spread more quickly because it's really a good story. Harvard professor Prince accused of all this stuff, and then the boring answers that I went through, this happened and that happened and the other thing, that's a boring story. So it will never get the kind of traction that the accusation makes. Also, the accusation is simple. He did it. The answer is always complicated. No, I couldn't have been there. I was here. No, this is... So you're always going to be playing catch-up when you're falsely accused. Look, I think it's so important that we recognize that women who are assaulted should be believed in general, should be listened to, shouldn't be disregarded, but their claims have to be thoroughly investigated like any other claims. And in fact, the rate of false reporting of rape is in fact 4 times higher than the rate of false reporting for other crimes. That's something that radical feminists don't like to hear, but it's true according to FBI analysis and statistics. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't investigate very carefully every single allegation. But remember, there are going to be false allegations. And a person falsely accused of rape has been seriously hurt, seriously punished. I don't want to make any comparisons between a person who has been sexually assaulted and someone who has been falsely accused of sexual assault. They're both very, very serious. And one of the hardest questions is, should women or men who make false accusations, deliberately make false accusations — I'm not talking about a date rape situation where the man says, I think she consented, and the woman says, no, I didn't. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where the woman makes up the whole story out of whole cloth about somebody she never met, and she does it deliberately for money. Whether women like that should be prosecuted and imprisoned for what they do, I think they should be. And I think they hurt the Me Too movement terribly when they do that. And the important thing about Me Too is that it's trying to promote truth, and truth requires process for determining truth. So I want to see women taken very seriously. I want to see universities spend more resources on dealing with women who have been sexually assaulted. I've represented women who have been sexually assaulted and sexually harassed. I'm on their side, but I also believe in due process.
I think we have time for one more question. Wait, do you have it?
I had this side, it's your side.
All right, we can take 2.
We'll take 2, okay.
All right, thank you. Oh, should I go? Yeah. All right, thank you for talking. I have a 2-part question. You can answer either. As we talk, Harvard's, and to a great extent our country's system of race-based affirmative action has just been litigated in court.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this case? And why, if you can get to their heads, do you think the attention of the media and our own exercisers of free speech are not glued to this issue?
Okay, it's a great question. As you know, Harvard is being sued by a coalition of people who claim that Harvard discriminates against Asian Americans. The Dean of Admissions at Harvard gave brilliant testimony the other day in which he explained Harvard's admission process, the need for diversity. I think Harvard will win that case. I don't think that Harvard has an explicitly race-based system, but I think there's no doubt that if you belong to certain groups, your chances of getting into competitive schools like Harvard and Colgate and others may vary. There are a lot of factors that influence admissions decisions, but I think in the end, Harvard will probably prevail. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dershowitz. Can you hear me? All right. Or yeah. So after this recent massacre in Pittsburgh, there's been a lot of push by different groups, especially Jewish organizations, to pass this anti-BDS law in the Senate. I know that Cory Booker, my senator, has recently approved it. And I was wondering, on the issue of free speech, whether or not it's justified for this act, which, if I remember correctly, prohibits companies from engaging in boycotting Israel, and also preventing the U.S. from complying with international like codes that would call for the boycott of Israel. Do you think that's justified?
It's a great question. I think I would divide the question into two. I think that you cannot constitutionally prohibit the advocacy of BDS. Anybody who wants to advocate boycotting Israel should have the right to do that. What I think you can do is prohibit economic activities that discriminate. For example, when I was on the other side of the case where the Supreme Court decided that if a gay couple who was getting married went to a baker and said, "Bake us a cake," and the baker said, "No, I won't bake you a cake because you're gay," I think the refusal to bake the cake is an economic act. The refusal to do business with a company is an economic act. So I would distinguish between advocacy on the one hand, which I think is constitutionally protected, and economic activities. For example, if I want to rent my apartment and some African-American person comes and says, "I want to rent your apartment," and I say, "No, you're black, I won't rent my apartment," that's illegal. But I'm allowed to get on the internet and say, "Nobody should rent apartments to black people. We should have a law permitting you not to rent your apartment." That's constitutionally protected. But the act of refusing to rent is not constitutionally protected. And the act of refusing to deal with a company because it's run by Israeli Jews. Remember, the BDS movement doesn't apply to Israeli Arabs or Israeli Christians. It only applies to Israeli Jews. So it's also religious discrimination. So again, I would draw the line between advocacy on the one hand and the act of economic discrimination on the other. Look, let me just end by saying I really appreciate you all coming here tonight and treating me respectfully, asking me hard questions. I wish the people who left had stayed. I think I might have learned from them if they had asked me hard questions. Maybe they could have learned from me, but I respect their right to peaceably protest me or protest my views or protest what they believe I did, even though they're wrong about that. But they have a right to do that. And I want to thank again Colgate University and the sponsoring organization, the professors, the president of the university, all of whom have treated me with enormous respect. And I think the ultimate victors are the audience. You came to hear me speak. I was allowed to speak. You now can go and disagree with what I've said or agree with what I've said. I've learned from the questions. I hope you've learned from me. And I think this was an excellent example of free speech at Colgate University. Thank you very much. Thank you.